Good morning, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started here. My name is Dave Peterson. I'm Director of the Africa Program here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm very happy to welcome you to our meeting this morning on democratic reform in Ethiopia. NED has supported projects in Ethiopia since 1991, shortly after the fall of the Derg. And it has become one of our most important programs in Africa, including work with various civil society groups, the business community through our Center for International Private Enterprise, and the labor movement with our Solidarity Center. Democracy has had its ups and downs, including slow but steady progress up until the 2005 elections in Ethiopia, which were followed by a severe closing of political space, including the passage of several laws restricting civil society, the independent press, and political activity. This was accompanied by the repression of opposition political parties, leading to their complete elimination from parliament in the most recent elections, the arrest of thousands of political prisoners, the suppression of scores of NGOs advocating human rights, the closing of most independent media, and the promotion of a developmental state ideology and mass political movement, as well as the steady conflation of party state, military, economy, and society. In short, an incipient totalitarian regime. Succeeding Meles Zenawi in 2012, the government of Haile Mariam Desalegn offered little respite from its predecessor, despite some hopes at the time. But a growing crescendo of protests led to his dramatic resignation last year, and the remarkable ascension of Abiy Ahmed as prime minister has revived hopes like never before. The scope, trajectory, challenges to, and sustainability of these reforms, as well as the role the international community, including NED and the U.S. government, can play in supporting them, is the topic of our discussion today. It's therefore my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Scott Busby, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where he is in charge of Africa, East Asia, and global affairs. His career in foreign service spans more than 25 years, most of it concerned with human rights and refugees. I would refer you to his bio for more details. Scott has been great at reaching out to the advocacy community here in Washington, including a meeting just a couple months ago that was focused on Ethiopia. And he just returned this past weekend from a trip to Ethiopia, and I know that we're going to be very privileged to hear his assessment. Just one last note before we get started. Shortly after Meles died, we held a conference on Ethiopia here at NED, similar to the one we're holding today. I must confess that at the time the State Department was not very forthcoming on Ethiopia, but one of Scott's predecessors at DRL, Karen Hanrahan, did agree to speak, and I believe her remarks were both prescient and courageous. Likewise, I hope that the changes occurring in Ethiopia and the Prime Minister's upcoming visit to Washington will mark a new era in U.S.-Ethiopian relations, and that the DRL and its mission will play a prominent role in forging it. Just before we get started, I would also like to acknowledge the great work that our program officer, Tiffany Lynch, has done in organizing this meeting. But without any more ado, Scott.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for inviting me to this important event. I think it's an incredibly exciting time in Ethiopia. Just the sort of conversations I had this morning indicated the enthusiasm, and I think one of the best barometers of the excitement around Ethiopia is when you talk to any Ethiopian or Eritrean taxi driver in Washington, D.C., of which there are many, and ask them their views about what's going on. Historically, I've had those sorts of conversations with them, and they've expressed great skepticism and cynicism about where Ethiopia and or Eritrea might be headed. That seems to have changed entirely. Yes, there are notes of caution, rightly so, in what everyone has to say, because it is still early days. But they are very hopeful, optimistic, and excited. Indeed, appropriately enough, on my way to the airport for this recent dialogue we had with the Ethiopian government, I did have an Ethiopian taxi driver, and he was thrilled to spend the taxi drive out to Dulles Airport talking to me about his thoughts about what was going on. And indeed, he told me that his own hope was that he might, in fact, be able to go back to his home in Addis Ababa. As Dave mentioned, we were there. Steve Kaufman, who was with me this morning, was also there with me to participate in our 8th dialogue with the Ethiopian government around human rights, democracy, and governance issues. And this dialogue has been around for a period of time. The last time it took place was in December in 2016. To be perfectly frank, we hadn't been chomping at the bit to do another iteration of the dialogue until Prime Minister Abiy took office and indicated his commitment to a wide array of reforms, which we are obviously very interested in supporting. So that was the reason for the dialogue, and I'll talk about it in a little more in just a second. I thought it would be worthwhile, even though a lot of you are following events there closely, to just review everything that has happened in the past few months under Prime Minister Abiy's leadership. One, the state of emergency, the most recent state of emergency imposed in February was lifted before it was scheduled to expire in August. The most notorious detention center in Addis Ababa was closed. Thousands of political prisoners, including many prominent opposition figures and journalists, have been released. And while we were there, we were pleased to hear that the review process to identify additional such persons continues. So it hasn't ended. We were unsure going into our meeting whether or not the government felt like its job was done in that regard, and pleased to hear from the Attorney General's office and others that they are affirmatively trying to identify additional prisoners who may be unjustly held and open to receiving information about others who may be unjustly held. So please, those of you in particular who may be in touch with people who know of folks who are unjustly detained should be aware that that process is ongoing. Prime Minister Abiy has removed several armed opposition groups from Ethiopia's list of designated terrorist organizations. He's encouraged the reinvigoration or establishment of political opposition by, among other things, calling for multi-party elections, which was done in a tweet just a few days ago, and publicly indicating that even if there may be people who disagree with the government's policies or views, that they too love their country. So clearly accepting the need for a plurality of views inside the country. He and the government have restored mobile internet throughout much of the country and reduced censorship of online news media and websites. They have encouraged media diversity, including all previously banned outlets run by opposition voices who have been forced to leave the country to return to Ethiopia. I should note that on the flight Steve and I took to Ethiopia for the dialogue, we were joined by Eskinder Nega, the famous blogger, who we had actually met with in Washington several weeks prior to that, and he has gone back specifically with the goal of trying to establish his satellite cable news channel. He likened it to CNN, but he said it would probably have a wider array of programming on it. And he was literally, we had dinner with him, and he was literally in the process of registering and trying to raise the funds for that project. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that in the days to come. Prime Minister Abiy has also retired prominent members of Ethiopia's political old guard, including security, defense, and intelligence officials. some of whom were viewed as threats to his reforms. He's directed government officials to work with independent experts encompassed in what's being called an advisory council on reforming laws that have been used for many years to stifle dissent, free speech, assembly, and discourage the operations of civil society organizations. For those who are not familiar with this process, they have in particular identified the Charity and Societies law, the media law, and the anti-terrorism proclamation as the three priority laws for reform. And there's a very ambitious and fast, short timeline under which this advisory council will make recommendations to the government for government action. So we're hopeful that those reforms will happen soon. While we were there last week, we learned that there is a labor reform, which, if it hasn't been adopted already, is about to be adopted. And significantly, that labor reform establishes a council, which in turn will establish a minimum wage for the country, a minimum wage that will probably be adjusted regionally depending on the standard of living in different parts of the country. This has been one of the major concerns of both the international labor community, but also international investors who felt that they faced reputational risks investing in a country without a decent minimum wage. And finally, and significant, as Dave has already alluded to, and as many of you are aware, Prime Minister Abiy's made a concerted effort to reach out to the diaspora community, encouraging them to invest in Ethiopia, come back to Ethiopia, bring their knowledge and tools back to Ethiopia. And this is culminating this week with the Prime Minister's arrival. I think it is tomorrow, in fact. And he will be, one of the major events, I know, is a big event at the Washington Convention Center. And we hear that it will be, I guess there aren't tickets, but it's anticipated to be a full event. So if you intend to go, go early. After that, he will be visiting Los Angeles and Minneapolis as well to talk to members of the diaspora community in those two places. So going back to the dialogue, as I mentioned, the last iteration was in December 2016. At that time, there was a lot of discussion about the CSO law. There was a provisional agreement to maybe create some sort of mechanism that would allow some civil society organizations working on only a limited range of issues to receive funding. That stalled after the dialogue. Right now, both we, civil society, and the government are talking much more broadly about reform, about importantly lifting the restriction of 10% of foreign funding that civil society organizations can receive, as well as other things. And so we met while we were there with two individuals who are involved in the process of reviewing the law and making recommendations. They clearly recognize the significant ways in which the CSO law restricts civil society and restricts the overall civic space inside the country. So we're hopeful that we'll see something positive on that. And I know NED, others, ICNL are also keenly following this process, as are we. The dialogue was made up of members of our mission there, led by our ambassador, Michael Rayner, who's done a superb job in leading our team and representing the United States, as well as four representatives from DRL, including Steve, myself, and a person importantly, from our programming office, because one of our goals in this process was to identify specific areas where DRL money might make a difference in the near term. DRL does not have the resources of a USAID or other parts of the U.S. government, but we do have resources that we can bring to bear, and we're talking right now about where they might be spent. After a fairly formal initial exchange in the dialogue between our ambassador and the state minister for foreign affairs who headed up the Ethiopian side of the dialogue. There was media in the room for that, so it was necessarily sort of formal. But once the media left, we had a very open and frank exchange. And while some of our requests could not be met with immediate agreements to do things because we didn't have all the right people in the room to make those sorts of decisions, there was certainly openness to hearing what we had to say and recognition of the significant range of reforms that need to be undertaken if the overall reform process is to succeed. At the conclusion of the dialogue, our embassy did issue a statement which indicated that there had been agreement to pursue cooperation on supporting and strengthening the electoral system, promoting the professional capacity of law enforcement, including enhancing greater respect for human rights, further developing and strengthening the judiciary and legal system, strengthening the role and capacity of civil society, widening the space to encourage independent professional media, improving Ethiopia's capacity to fight corruption, and enhancing a system of accountability for human rights abuses. You can find that statement online. So those are the broad categories of areas on which we're going to be continue to talking with them. But that doesn't limit us to only those topics. If other issues come up in other areas, we'll be talking to them about that as well. So these are all the positives in what is a very exciting and overall very positive context. But I think it's important, we think it's important to also be clear-eyed about the challenges that lay ahead. Presently, local elections are scheduled for 2019, less than a year away, and then national elections are called for under their constitution in 2020. So that means time is short to create the changes needed to allow for strong opposition parties to emerge and be competitive in the manner Prime Minister Abiy has said he wants. It also doesn't leave a lot of time for civil society organizations to form or to be rejuvenated and to play the role they need to play in monitoring the variety of issues that might arise in the lead up to these elections as well as the elections themselves. There needs to be an entire infrastructure of supporting institutions that needs to be both reviewed and created. Since the EPRDF has been in power for 27 years, it populates and continues to oversee virtually all governmental processes that occur in the country. And so it's going to take time to build credible opposition voices, not only in Addis Ababa, but at the local level. And a lot of people made that point to us, that Ethiopia is a big, complex country, variety of ethnic groups. Some areas, parts of the country are less accessible, less reachable than others. And so expanding these reforms and the changes throughout the country is going to take time. And it remains the case that the ruling party maintains power and significant influence throughout the country in a way that alternative institutions don't have now and are unlikely to have in the very near term. As I mentioned, the restrictive CSO law was a focus of our conversations. It's clearly a focus of the government's attention. We did meet with the largest remaining human rights NGO in the country, the Human Rights Council, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, and they told us that the law continues to constrain their ability to operate. And so we emphasized to the government the importance of modifying this law in an appropriate way as soon as possible. So we're hoping that that will happen. Additionally, there have been ongoing ethnic conflicts in many parts of the country, which, along with the effects of natural disasters, have led to significant internal population displacement. Indeed, there are over 2 million people who are internally displaced throughout Ethiopia, some of whom are getting assistance, others of whom are having a hard time getting assistance. Not all international organizations and NGOs are able to get access to these folks. And in addition, there are underlying sources of conflict that have brought about this internal displacement that still need to be addressed and resolved. And indeed, in this period of opening up, as we've seen in the former Soviet Union, in the late 80s and early 90s, in the former Yugoslavia, sometimes with opening, long tamped down tensions and conflicts emerge again. And I think we need to be very attuned to and address those issues. Building a legal and a fully legal and credible judicial system is also going to be a significant challenge, as well as an adequate police force. I was surprised to learn that the size of Ethiopia's police force, I forget the actual number, but it clearly is inadequate to police the entire country, which is why, for some of these conflict situations, the military has been called in to do what is essentially police work. And so building up the police to do policing in a responsible, human rights respecting way is also going to be an important thing to do. The prison system is in need of attention, both to improve conditions for inmates and to reduce lengthy waits for trials. We heard both when we were here before going and then when we were in Ethiopia that members of the diaspora, while wishing to become re-engaged, still have some caution about doing so, not only for their personal safety, but in terms of their investments. They aren't totally confident that their investments can be protected from corruption or other arbitrary dealings when they are there. So a system of checks, again, a credible judicial system needs to be put in place to help ensure that the diaspora truly can come back with their skills and assets to help the country. And developing and implementing a fully credible system of labor standards is a remaining important challenge. We were pleased to be received by the Minister of Labor. She's a relatively new appointee, a woman who had been the Minister of Tourism and Culture. She's very committed to doing the right thing, but she herself acknowledged that they don't have enough labor inspectors, the labor inspectors are not adequately trained, and that they do need improved standards to enforce. One of the notable things about the country that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of is that the Chinese continue to maintain have a significant presence in the society. Indeed, as you drive through Addis Ababa, as some of you I'm sure have done, you'll see signs in Chinese of next to buildings that are under construction or have been recently constructed. In fact, one member of our embassy said that the word for Chinese has replaced the word for foreigner that people, particularly outside Addis Ababa, use when they see any foreigner, because the presence of Chinese is so significant throughout the country. And last but not least, there needs to be some system of accountability. I know Sarah Margon is going to talk about this in her own remarks, so I won't get into the details. Clearly, this is going to be a challenge, given the range of abuses that have taken place over an incredibly long period of time. So setting up a process and system that allows victims of injustice to feel some sense of justice while at the same time allowing the society to move forward is going to be probably one of the most significant challenges going forward. We were very pleasantly pleased to hear the Ethiopian side in the dialogue talk about the need for accountability. They haven't figured out what the details of that looks like yet. It's obviously a very sensitive topic, but they clearly are open to that discussion, and they are certainly committed to ensuring that the security forces going forward operate in an accountable way. Again, to Prime Minister Abiy's credit and to the government's credit, all of these challenges were acknowledged by the government over the course of our dialogue, or have been acknowledged in other ways in recent months. So that's another, I think, positive thing about what's going on. So what do we collectively, those of us committed to supporting this democratic reform process, need to think about? Obviously, supporting civil society through this process is going to be critical. Helping those CSOs that already exist to be strengthened, as well as helping new civil society organizations form, is going to be a really important task. We also, as I've mentioned, must look at ways of strengthening the rule of law and an independent judiciary. Clearly, the creation or reinvigoration of independent political parties is a crucial task to, if these forthcoming elections, both at the local level and at the national level, are going to be credible. Foreign investment needs to be something that's looked at. There's a major foreign exchange problem in the country which the government's trying to address. They're very eager to attract foreign investment. And so one of the things I think we need to do is talk to American business, both about the positive things that are going on in Ethiopia, the opportunities there, but also making sure that they bring respect for fundamental labor rights, respect for basic human rights to the table if and when they come to Ethiopia. As many of you probably know, one of Ethiopia's economic development strategies is to try to industrialize the country to a greater extent, and they are doing so by creating factory zones for foreign investment throughout the country. There are 4 or 5 that have been created already. There are a number slated to be created. There's a lot of scrutiny about that process, and I think we just need to encourage American businesses, and for that matter, all international businesses, to bring respect for basic rights to the table as they consider those investments. The media environment is going to be key, supporting independent outlets. And in the prisoner release process, I think we need to think not only about getting people released, but about the reintegration and rehabilitation process for these folks, because some of these folks have been out of society for a long period of time. Some have been tortured. It's not going to be easy for them to become fully productive members of society again. In Burma, for instance, we have had supported a long-standing program to facilitate the reintegration and rehabilitation of the political prisoners who've been released there. So we're going to be thinking about whether or not a similar program for Ethiopia makes sense. And lastly, of course, coming up with sensible, appropriate approaches to accountability is going to be key. So with that, let me leave it. Happy to answer any questions during the discussion, and look forward to hearing the comments of my colleagues who know Ethiopia and have thought about Ethiopia much longer than I have. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Scott has covered a lot of ground for me and saved me some trouble. But Ethiopia is a big country, and I have a lot to say about it. So I'm gonna say a few things, but try to save the thunder for my panelists here. Let me start by taking us back a little bit. I've spent a little bit of time thinking about where Ethiopia was, where it's come, and where it's going, which is very hard to project with the pace of changes coming out of the country right now. 26 years ago, rebels in Ethiopia stormed the capital, Addis Ababa, and brought down the Marxist Derg and its authoritarian ruler, Mengistu Haile Mariam. Over 150,000 students, academics, and government critics are estimated to have been killed during that period. Many more were tortured, arrested, or disappeared. Those rebels, they formed a government. It was led by a man who President Clinton once described as an example of Africa's new generation of leaders, part of an African renaissance. Meles Zenawi declared in those early days that he would consider his government a success if Ethiopians were able to eat 3 meals a day. Donors responded with cautious optimism, but with conditions. No democracy, no cooperation. Some famous words once said by former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Hank Cohen, who was the top U.S. official on Africa policy when the EPRDF came into power. He was also the mediator for the Ethiopia peace talks at the time. Meles offered a concept of the democratic developmental state. There's been a lot written about it. He said a lot about it. And the basic idea was that the path to economic growth for the country was through a strong state. His policies delivered growth, scoring over 10% growth in many years before his death in 2012. But the country drew increasing criticism for its track record on democracy and human rights. Deputy Assistant Secretary Busby talked about the Dave did about the 2005 elections, and those were a turning point. There was a lot of anticipation. The opposition gained a great amount of ground. The elections were peaceful, but the aftermath was tragic. Hundreds of protesters killed by security forces in the streets, crackdown on protests, crackdown on civil society organizations and opposition and journalists. And Ethiopia would worsen progressively over the next decade in the Fragile States Index and in a number of other indices. You look at records or rankings on press freedom, on democratic freedoms. Ethiopia ranked not free, one of the most censored countries in the world. And space for critical voices in the country shrunk. Restrictive legislation introduced in the aftermath of those elections, which has been mentioned, became a model for other countries wanting to crack down on criticism. When the EPRDF took over in 1991, a spokesman for the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, said these prophetic words that I came across earlier this week. "We feel we've been left out. We're afraid that the fundamental causes have not been solved and that there's room for future conflicts." Fast forward to 2015. Protests are growing in Oromia. Into 2016, I was in Addis on the eve before the state of emergency was implemented in October of 2016. And the mood was tense and it was grim. The government was defensive. And in the aftermath of that state of emergency and leading up to it, tens of thousands of people were reportedly arrested and detained. Hundreds or more were killed in protests and in a violent crackdown by security forces. In 2017, the Fragile States Index declared Ethiopia the most worsened country in terms of its ranking on the index. Things really sort of were, I think, at a very, very low point. But by the end of last year, we started to see some change. And early this year, release of some political prisoners, some letting off of steam. And then there was the decision by Prime Minister Haile Mariam to step down and eventually Prime Minister Abiy to be elected by the PRDF. I'm not going to go into all of the changes that we've seen. It's very difficult to keep track of them, and fortunately Scott has gone through them. But I want to talk about the mood, and I think we've all heard about it from Ethiopian friends and family members and seen it. I spoke to somebody yesterday who just recently got back from his first trip to the country in over 16 years. He talked about hope and optimism, particularly among young people in the country. It's a little hard to see from here, and even from Addis, how widespread that hope is in some parts of the country. There are over 2 million people displaced right now, most of them from conflict, particularly between Oromia and Somali regions and the southern SNMP region. So there are some major difficulties that this government has to grapple with as it sort of tries to turn a new path. Earlier this week, over the weekend, the Prime Minister declared, though, that Ethiopia had no option but to pursue multi-party democracy supported by strong institutions that respect human rights and the rule of law. There are outstanding questions, as we've talked about accountability and justice. But there is talk of legal changes, efforts underway to make reforms to some of the laws that have been widely criticized by human rights and democracy advocates. The outreach that the Prime Minister and his government have had to opposition groups, both armed and unarmed, is a very positive sign, and it seems to be very well received by those leaders. I've had the opportunity to talk to a few of them, to Eskinder Nega, to Bekele Gerba, and it is somewhat surprising to hear sort of their own personal optimism about where things are going. But there are still a lot of questions. So I'm going to turn it over to the experts here. We didn't decide which order we were going to go in. You want to go first? Okay. All right. We're going to start with Sarah Margon, the director of the Washington office for Human Rights Watch, and then we will move on to Yoseph Badwaza, who is with Freedom House now and former Secretary General of the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, and Ameha, I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, I know it, and Mekonnen, who I am just now recalling, I think that we had dinner together in 2016 when I was in Addis. And it was a rather grim dinner. But I'm looking forward to what they have to say, thoughts about the past, the present, and where Ethiopia is heading.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. I've been asked to keep my remarks to 5 to 7 minutes, so I'm going to try to do that. But mostly because I think the two men to my left will bring some really good weedy analysis that I am not going to provide you with in quite the same way. In looking at a list of the tweets, comments, public statements that the Prime Minister has made over the last 4 months, when they were put all on a list for me on Monday, it totally blew my mind to see everything that was there and to see all of the commitment. We talk a lot here in Washington and also at Human Rights Watch about political will. It's actually a phrase I hate because it's become very empty. It doesn't mean anything. And we have seen time and time again, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that one individual is not and cannot do things of that magnitude. Oh, well, if there was the political will, you could see major change, security sector reform. But in fact, what the Prime Minister has shown over the last 4 months is that political will does still have a meaning. And it is incredible to see the potential that comes with someone who is clearly dedicated to trying to do the right thing and excited to try to do so. Now, at the risk of sounding overly optimistic, because I do work for Human Rights Watch, there's still, I think, as everyone before me has said, a long, difficult path for actually implementing a lot of these inclusive, more democratic reforms that will ultimately bring about a more prosperous Ethiopia and benefit Ethiopians as well, frankly, as the region. The path, the speed of commitment is pretty insane if you think about it. I mean, not only do you have an election likely upcoming in 2019 and then 2020, but you have a commitment to make changes on some major political, legal, and even security-related reforms that require bringing an entire apparatus with him, an apparatus and a number of different groups that have been very reluctant to change. If you look back at the history of Ethiopia, not necessarily over the last 20 plus years, but even over the last decade, you see that at any moment when there is dissent and there is opportunity, there is also clampdown from the central federal government. And that instead of encouraging commitment to openness and encouraging alternative voices, the government has gone in the other direction. So there is a shining light at this moment, and I think under Abiy's leadership, we have seen some of those steps forward. He's injected hope. He's been pretty clever in his diplomatic moves, and he has made some edgy decisions, which is and creates opportunity not just for Ethiopians, but for the diaspora, for donor governments, for the United Nations, and for some of the regional actors who have been watching and hoping. And I think as we look at where the next steps are, whether it is, we've seen hundreds of freed political prisoners. We've seen the closure of Makalawi, which is just had been one of the most horrific detention centers, as many of you know. We've also seen, and I was really struck by this on Scott's recent trip to Addis, a tweet with the word accountability in it, which I think Scott mentioned. And in 2007, when I was working in the Senate, I tried to move a bill. We introduced a bill on human rights and democracy in Ethiopia. And at that time, not only was accountability sort of a bad word here in Washington when you talked about Ethiopia, but it was a horrific word to talk about in Ethiopia itself. I went to Addis, and that was basically the last time I was allowed to go there. And I went and tried to raise questions of accountability and reform, and basically everyone looked at me, rolled their eyes, and said absolutely not. I then, when I came back from Addis, had the Ethiopian ambassador storm into my office and call me and the senator. I was working for diaspora-loving Eritrean loving individuals. And I thought, this is going to be a really productive relationship, I can tell straight off the bat. And in fact, it was not a productive relationship. And so what this gives me is now sort of looking at some of the changes here. I think what we're seeing is that, again, there is room for others to speak. There are room for others to offer ideas. It's not just up to organizations like Human Rights Watch and the U.S. government, but it's also up to the diaspora, not just to take the prime minister at his word, but to hold him and ensure that there's implementation of the commitments he has put forward. Because going forward, the rhetoric is going to be so important. That has injected potential change, but it is actually ensuring that those changes are made and making sure that individuals get what they need from the government and see it change in the right direction. So I want to talk about three baskets of issues where I think the rubber needs to meet the road, for lack of a better phrase. The first is on accountability. The second is on legal reform, which we've already touched on a little bit. And then the third is on some of the electoral environment as we move towards elections. So as I said, accountability has been a very bad word. And I think what it means in the Ethiopian context is, on the one hand, going to be particularly of an Ethiopian nature. On the other hand, there's some pretty basic things that need to happen. The removal of senior level officials who have committed abuses, sacking them, as we say, is in a sense a good first step for the here and now. We see this all over the world, whether it's in Burma or Afghanistan or Iraq, taking senior leaders who have done bad things or commanded bad operations that have abused people out of their job, retiring them early. That's a good first step. But it's not the end-all, be-all. It doesn't actually get the victims the justice that they need. And so if we look at the numbers of individuals who have been tortured and the widespread patterns of impunity, not just in the federal government in Ethiopia, but also in many of the regional governments, what we're looking at is a need for some kind of reckoning. And how that is exactly going to play out is going to be really difficult to tell. But many of you may have seen, we recently put out a report called Jail Ogaden, and I think this provides a really good example for a potential path forward. Right before our report was released, the Prime Minister sacked the head of the Federal Prison Service, which was really incredible to see and certainly welcomed. It doesn't actually deal with the regional situation in the same way. As many of you know, probably far better than I, the regions are quite autonomous in how they're able to do business. And so if you look at and read through our report, which is a collection of testimony and video that was smuggled out of the Ogaden prison from 2011 to 2018. It's really some gruesome stuff. We watched 25 hours of footage and did over 100 interviews, 70 of which I think were with former Jail Ogaden prisoners themselves. what you realize is that there needs to be a process for addressing this at the regional level. And so the collective punishment requires not just a closing of the jail, which has, there was some news that it was closed, then there was news that it was not. I think many people would like to see this jail closed. But I think one of the things that we have seen as, we have suggested as a model is that you start with a federal commission of experts that investigates what happened in the prison and then recommends specific individuals for prosecution. This is similar to what you see at the United Nations level. But this would be a national commission. You could do this on a regional level, starting with the Ogaden. You could do it with the support of key regional actors and experts who have done this. We would recommend in the case of Ogaden that the regional Somali president, Abdel also be investigated and prosecuted, given his very serious commitment, I would say, to abuse over a number of decades. That, in that case, goes all the way up to the top of the region. That may be very different in other regions. But that kind of commitment from the federal level to engage the regions in the torture, abuse, and impunity that we have seen over many years would be a beginning sign of an interest in engaging many of the different ethnic communities that have suffered at a very meaningful level. Another really important step would be letting in international monitors like Human Rights Watch, but certainly many others, into the country. There are also, if I'm not mistaken, basically every UN rapporteur that has requested access to Ethiopia and been denied. So you could start with the UN rapporteur on torture and systematically allow them into the country one by one to do investigations and then release their reports. This would be a constructive way to engage. It would show the international community as well as Ethiopians that you're committed to engaging in a process of accountability through both the channels that exist and crafting your own national channel so that Ethiopians can engage at a level that is meaningful for them. I want to move, I'll stop there because I want to move to some of the other issues, but I think legal reform, when Scott just said there is in fact a timeline to reform the CSO, media law, and anti-terrorism proclamation, I almost fell out of my chair. The fact that these laws, which are some of the most draconian I've ever seen, particularly the CSO law, and have become a model that has been replicated not only across the continent at this point, but actually around the world as we see clamping down on civil society space, the fact that they may not just be reformed, but meaningfully reformed, but potentially repealed and replaced with something is astounding. The fact that the committee, the task force that has been set up, has actually a number of very strong individuals on it, some of which I understand may be funded by NED, is incredible. So that, setting that timeline, being very clear and deliberate and publicizing that timeline, putting out drafts of the legislation or the amendments is going to be hugely important so that donor governments, organizations, ICNL can take a look at them, but also so Ethiopians can see them. They have a right to see what kind of changes are going to happen in their country. I will say that U.S. technical support here could be really meaningful. It was very disheartening in 2008 and 2009 to see how slow the United States government and the embassy was in particular to addressing the drafts of those laws, which ultimately got passed. They didn't take them seriously. And as a result, they weren't engaged in a process to moderate what was put forward. So in early engagement and support moving in the right direction will be really, really important. I don't have much more to say on that than there needs to be a public timeline and it needs to be adhered to and supported. The fact that that is in process right now is really exciting. And I hope that it will ultimately lead to stopping some of the threats of criminal charges for so many people who are just trying to raise their voices, put different opinions out there, and do their work, many of whom I suspect are here in the audience. And then finally, on electoral reform, Human Rights Watch as an organization doesn't comment on elections, but what we do comment on is the environment in which they take place. And so in looking towards 2020 as a benchmark, I think looking at how much progress has been made for this multi-party pluralism, for independent media to really get up and running and actually promote alternative voices, for the parties to have the support and engagement they need from outside actors. We all know, I think, in this room, the role of IRI and NDI in being demonized by the Ethiopian government in the past, seeing that flip entirely and allowing them to support the procedures to make an election viable, campaigning opportunities, for something widespread would be so valid and important, and really ensure that, the last elections, which I'm not mistaken, were 100% in favor of EPRDF and then 99.5%, or maybe it was the reverse, in favor of EPRDF, actually were meaningful elections, transparent, clear, and that people were able to vote and participate on their own accords is hugely important. So we'll be watching that environment very carefully. I think, as Scott said, it's a close timeline. There's not a lot of time to get things going. Right now, all signs are moving in the right direction, but there are certainly going to be obstacles and challenges to making that happen. And I would just say that maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. government, which is both very important and does not necessarily need to be the lead here, which I find to be very positive. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the National Endowment for Democracy for organizing this timely conversation. I've been asked to speak on CSO opportunities and challenges, or challenges and opportunities for potential for re-engagement. So I would just be limiting my remarks to that specific topic. In terms of the head-spinning developments over the past 6 months, as many of my compatriots, there is reason to feel very optimistic about what is to come in Ethiopia. But also I feel like there is also this critical need to institutionalize and, frankly, depersonalize the reforms from the person of the Prime Minister in terms of bringing more and more supporters in key political positions coming to the front, being empowered, and be embraced by the public as the Prime Minister has been. So that is something I think we need to be paying attention to. In terms of the challenge for civil society re-engagement, I think any discussion of these challenges won't be complete without first looking at some background pointers in terms of how we get there, how the state of civil society in Ethiopia has become so dire that it reached to the point of non-existent under EPRDF's 27 years rule. So one challenge I would comment on is the erosion of public trust to the sector, and that is as a result of years of ideology-driven propaganda and smear campaign by the ruling parties that attacked the core of the legitimacy of civil society organizations. And that was relentless in terms of framing the whole sector as rent-seeking elements, agents of the West, and essentially parasites that attack communities and publics in furtherance of their own benefits. So this significantly eroded public trust towards civil society is, I think, going to be a huge challenge when we think of re-engaging the sector. The other, evidently, is the laws and the regulations that have been that have essentially codified EPRDF's outlook on non-state actors, essentially attacking everyone, demonizing anyone that chose to speak independently and in public in opposition to what is the official line of developmental and at times revolutionary democracy. So the laws and the overzealous enforcement agencies, particularly the Charities and Societies Agency, are also going to be a challenge. Of course, this initiative of setting up this advisory council, Legal and Justice System Advisory Council, is a great opportunity, and there's going to be a lot of expectations from the community, from all civil society actors, in terms of not just fixing the legislative framework and the regulatory components of it, but also charting out a new, I will mention that in my opportunities part, but in terms of providing the space for civil society actors, fixing this regulatory framework is a key. The other somehow related to these years of relentless propaganda and smear campaign is this distrust, EPRDF's strategy of playing favorites, even among the civil society community, demonizing others while trying to make the rest feel close to it, helped to sow this significant amount of distrust among the civil society community. So this impeded any sort of collaborative action on the part of this community. The distrust is so deep that not two organizations would want to sit in the same room abroad, not in Addis, outside of Ethiopia, because of that level of distrust. So I think this is going to be another significant challenge in dealing with re-engagement. The other, of course, is all the combination of this vigorous application of draconian legislation coupled with this wave of crackdown on anyone that dare to come up in public to speak or propagate a message that is different from the official line, resulted in the significant diminishing of civil society capacity to plan and execute any impactful activities. So there is going to be a very monumental task of trying to rebuild that diminished capacity among civil society organizations if they are going to regain their independence and claim the space and play the role that they are supposed to be playing. Another factor is this profound climate of fear. It's not easy to just shed this fear just because of the developments in the past few months. There needs to be more guarantees. There needs to be more institutionalized moves on the part of the government to actually assure these actors that the changes that are taking place are there to stay. So dealing with that element of that profound climate of fear is going to be another challenge. The other, probably a more subtle challenge I see is part of EPRDF's strategy in dealing with the civil society sector with this massive scheme of co-optation, that is party-affiliated associations, mass associations as they call them, the youth association, the women's association, all forms of association have been supported financially, given political backing, and were made to take the space at the expense of independent civil society. So in terms of dealing with the sector in general, I think this co-optation and the consequence that it brought in terms of empowering these party-affiliated, EPRDF-affiliated mass associations who have been playing election observers' roles and providing outright validity to what used to be conducted in the name of elections in Ethiopia in the past years. These have been the entities that were presented by the government as civil society organizations at the expense of genuine, independent, change-seeking organizations. So dealing with this problem of co-optation and the entities that were created as a result of that, and in fact trying to reintegrate these groups or rebrand their purpose, or dealing with them in one way or another is going to be a significant challenge, because there have been an opportunity for jobs for many young people who have expressed loyalty to party lines. So there is going to be a challenge. So most importantly, I think, in terms of addressing these challenges is understanding this co-optation, infiltration, and sometimes outright dismantling of independent organization is really important. What happened to the Ethiopian Teachers Association, what happened to the Confederation of Ethiopian Trade Unions is a very recent memory in terms of dismantling genuine representative organizations and replacing them effectively with party satellites. So these are the ones when donors are trying to get to the country and re-engage the community. I think these are the nuances that they need to be looking at. So I would say in terms of addressing these challenges and designing the interventions, fixing the laws, the legal framework is not going to be enough. I think we should also look into finding ways of injecting some new energy to these genuine independent organizations so that they can reclaim their independence, regain a sense of purpose and goal, and essentially get them develop a level of trust that helps them to work together and speak in a unified voice. I think in terms of opportunities, the legal reform process that my colleagues have been speaking about provides a key opportunity for civil society organizations. The Legal and Justice System Advisory Council is composed of 13 independent, very able professional lawyers. It's under the Attorney General's office, and I understand there is also several subcommittees working on the laws that have been identified as key for reform. But I think there needs to be a clear indication, a clear stand on the part of the government to have civil society actors, human rights organizations that have been on the receiving end of this draconian legislation and the effects of them be meaningfully represented in any legal reform process. So integrating them in these committees, trying to get their feedback. As Sarah was saying, when drafts are discussed, trying to organize as many open public level discussions would be critical. But I think one key gain for civil society organization from all these legal reform processes that the long-standing question of civil society organizations for self-regulation. This is very, I think, critical in terms of giving that an institutional backing in terms of making it part of the new law that is supposed to be coming out either by repealing the Churches and Societies Proclamation or by significantly revising it. So self-regulation for civil society organizations, trying to get them to get a code of conduct in how they manage and articulate their stance is going to be critical. Another opportunity I see for civil society organizations, given, I think, understanding the capacity limitations as well, is the election and the upcoming elections. I think they have the opportunity to own, lead, and guide the discourse in regarding civic space, positioning themselves for get out the vote work and election monitoring, and also in relation to these recurring ethnic clashes. I think there is a lot to be done in terms of supporting community-based interventions of conflict management for civil society organizations. Deploying the army every time a conflict flares up is not going to solve the problem in a permanent manner. So the general idea of consensus building, because of the significant polarization of views as a result of this serious repression, is also another opportunity for civil society organizations. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Ameha. I'm practicing lawyer. In fact, I'm also a board chairperson of the only independent human rights organization in Ethiopia for 100 million people, the Human Rights Council. Previously, it was called Ethiopian Human Rights Council, but after the new civil society and charity laws was elected, we were not, although we are Ethiopians, we were not allowed to use the name Ethiopian because we couldn't have office for beyond or for more than 3 regions. The same law prevented us not to have, to close all our offices which were established throughout the country, because we were not, first the government confiscated the funding that we collected prior to this law. Then we were prevented to get more than 10% of our budget from foreign source, so we had to close 6 or 7 of our offices. We have to terminate the contract of the employees for nearly 100 employees. We had to close many of our programs, but thanks to many esteemed leaders in the organization, including my friend who has been ex-chairperson of the organization, thanks to many really committed individuals who have sacrificed their life, their liberty, the organization still existed, though in its very weak position. But today I'm speaking here representing my own law office. In fact, I'm very much willing to answer some questions in relation to the space for the civil society, if it is directly related to HIRCO. So I thank National Endowment for Democracy for giving me this chance to speak before you, ladies and gentlemen, and Your Excellency. Also, I thank all of you here with us today to discuss the situation in Ethiopia at this very, very important moment. I've got several chances to speak on the human rights situation in Ethiopia. Whenever I was given the chance and speak about the situation, I was almost always depressed because there was nothing to speak good about the situation. Today I'm speaking here with really a different mood, a different vision, because as many Ethiopians and probably as many of you, really we have a good hope in the future. There are reform programs, as many of have them mentioned, concrete reform programs initiated, to which some of the programs I myself is a part. So when I speak the challenges, the problems, in fact, Tiffany assigned me to speak on opportunities on judicial reform. I have never been a judge except in moot courts, but as a practicing lawyer, especially representing many of opposition members, bloggers, journalists, I had to confront the judiciary. I wouldn't say it litigation. It was not a mere litigation. It was almost confrontation. I have learned many of the gaps there. As many or all of you know, for the last 27 years, Ethiopia has been in a very, very difficult situation, and the last 3 years were the worst. I think I don't have to mention what was happening during these years, but it was really a horrible situation. Many have paid their life, many have paid their liberty, many left the country and living in exile. So all this problem can be explained in terms of many factors. You may mention lack of good governance. You may mention poor political culture, and etc., etc. But many, including myself, believe lack of justice played the major role in creating or exasperation within the public. One can tolerate administrative repression as long as he or she has somewhere to go to seek and find justice. But when the justice sector itself is used as an instrument to repress or support the repressive action of the government, I think it is natural for anyone to revolt. That is what was happening for the last 3. The people were very calm, hoping for changes to come, but that change the people thought couldn't come. So the reason why finally revolted in the last 3 years is basically due to lack of justice. The justice sector was almost collapsed in Ethiopia, was not independent. It was not, or it was highly crowded and totally ineffective. And even as I said, some of us believe it was used as a best means to legitimize repression. It was the judiciary which receives accusations, criminal charges based on those draconian laws, including the ATP, and sentence many of them to severe punishment and send thousands to jail. To date, even we are not able to really identify how many people do we have in jail. You know, the significant amount, the huge number of people sent to jail is due to the inactive role of the judiciary. Now there is a big opportunity to reform the judiciary. The opportunity is Dr. Abiy, he publicly recognized the judiciary was under a very, very low standard, incapable of giving justice to the public. But although we have seen many revolutionary measures being taken in relation to other sectors like the defense, the security agents and other sectors, nothing has been done in relation to the judiciary so far. In fact, reforming the judiciary is identified as one sub-program in the overall reform program initiated by the Ministry of the Prime Minister Office. So we hope, I know the judiciary is a very unique entity as compared to the executive and the military. It has to be, if there should be a reform, it has to be taken very cautiously. So it looks the Prime Minister is waiting time and opportunities, but many of us hope there will be reformative measures to be taken very soon. So with this background, what were the problems with the judiciary? The Constitution provides for an independent judiciary to be created in the country. The same Constitution also provides for an independent judicial council to be created. But it is hardly possible to believe the council was really independent. The judicial council was composed of 30 individuals, 3 from the parliament, and the presidents of all levels of the courts are members of the council, and 1 attorney and 1 academician will also be part of the council. But with the problem with the council is, as I said, there is a big dominance of the executive, because 3 of them are from the parliament. As many or all of you know, the parliament is composed of representatives of the ruling party, especially after the previous election. It is 100% controlled by the ruling party. So obviously, the 3 individuals are representing the party. Although the Constitution say 1 attorney and 1 academician will be part of the council, it is not the lawyers association or the academic institution that assigns the individuals. It is the judicial council itself again, which picks a lawyer and a university professor. So the judicial council, which is in charge of administrating the judiciary, is totally partial, not independent. Another issue which has to do with the judicial council is, many of the judges who really tried to provide independent service are subjected to disciplinary action, because there is no clear dichotomy between judicial error and judicial misconduct. So the council uses the opportunity to threaten many of the judges under the pretext of judicial pretext, while the case may be just a judicial error that could have been easily corrected through the normal procedure. The other problem is the assignment of the leadership of the judiciary. Under the Constitution, the leadership, especially the President and Deputy President of the Supreme Court, will be directly assigned by the Prime Minister of the country, the executive. Other judges also, although the judiciary has some role to recruit judges, no one will be presented to the Parliament unless endorsed by the Prime Minister again, the Prime Minister office. The Prime Minister office is always has the final say on who is going to be assigned as a judge by the House of Parliament. Other leaders of the judiciary at the High Court and lower level court, some are directly picked from the executive branch. Some are widely believed to be members of the intelligence. So the leadership is not considered at all by the larger the public as independent. It's not only because just they speak the language of the executive, but their back history is a clear indication that they cannot be trusted as an independent leaders of the judiciary. The other major problem we had with the judiciary is related to the role of constitutional interpretation. Again, as many of you may know, the power to interpret or to do the constitutional interpretation is rendered to a political body, not to the judiciary. It is the House of Federation, which is composed of representatives from every region, which have the power to do the constitutional interpretation. So many propose this power should be reinstated into the judiciary. Probably some kind of dichotomy can be created between, there are some constitutional issues which truly look like political issues, like conflicts between two or three ethnic groups, border issue. This can remain in the hands of the government. Otherwise, issues related to constitutional interpretation, especially in relation to some basic human rights standards, should be reinstated into the judiciary. The procedure for the recruitment of the judge should also be very much transparent, should be based on merits, which was not the case. The training of judges also should be initiated by the judges themselves, but these days training was initiated from the executive, not from the judges themselves. We have also a training center, which is a model of the French training center for the judges and the prosecutors, but the content was, many say, still it's a kind of law school. It doesn't provide the necessary skill for the judges. The admission procedure also must be clear. This time, the admission procedure in the training center is through recommendation of the executive and regional bureaus, not through competition. It should be competition. Judges' benefits and privilege should also be taken into account. So, had this, at least this elements in the judiciary has been reformed, I think it would help the democratization process very much. Thank you.
I can't get my microphone working, so I'm going to steal Sarah's. All right, I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone to kick off the question and answer phase of this event, but I think we've got a pretty good amount of time to have a good dialogue. I have two questions that I'm going to put out there. The first is on this idea of what some are calling Abimania. He has a bit of a cult of personality. I think you look at what's happened in his first 100, we're now past 100 days in office, and I'm not sure that any leader on the continent could keep up with him. And I think, it sets a very high bar of expectations. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how much support he has for the things he's talked about and has started to put underway within the ruling coalition. The EPRDF acknowledged the need for reform late last year, early this year, but put out some pretty mixed messages about what its idea of reform was and how far it was going to go. So some thoughts on that. I noticed earlier this week, I think, Hank Cohen, who I mentioned earlier, former Reagan administration Africa official, put out the idea that he would nominate Abiy for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I don't know if Hank Cohen has the ability to make that nomination or if he's just started a very loud whisper campaign on Twitter, but it's an idea that you see talked about quite a bit in the press, and beyond Abiy, who can't do this all himself, how deep is the support for reform? The second question is on U.S. policy. I work for the Congressional Research Service and for Congress, and there's been quite a bit of attention and interest in Congress now and over the years in Ethiopia. There have been several pieces of legislation that Congress has been considering. One which passed the House earlier this year, HRES 128, which called for support, provided U.S. support for respect for human rights and encouraging inclusive governance in Ethiopia. There's a Senate companion that is still on the Senate floor and may be subject to some revision based on some of the changes that have been going on in Ethiopia. But what are your thoughts based on what Scott Busby has said about sort of U.S. policy, sort of top priorities that you would ask for from this administration and from Congress in terms of U.S. priorities? The U.S. has a great investment in Ethiopia, over $1 billion every year in development, health, and humanitarian assistance, a number of initiatives to support economic growth in the country, including through Power Africa. But in terms of enhancing democratic governance, human rights, and supporting this push for reform, what are sort of some top ideas? And I'm going to open it up actually to maybe two more questions. We'll add these in. I know, and you can, but they'll probably overlap. Okay, so one question from this side and then one question from this side. Keith.
Thank you. Yes, I was just curious, given that the local elections are scheduled for May 2019, what would be your reactions if those elections were postponed by Dr. Abiy?
Okay, and on this side. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. Just as a background, I go to Ethiopia since 1999, at least 3-4 times a year. I'm just wondering what the real thrust of the discussion today is. As far as I know, the EPDRF government is still in place. As far as I know, and I have tried to conduct kind of a Kurt Lewin's idea, for those of you who know change management, forces for change and forces against change. And my analysis informs me that some of the questions, for example, the idea of accountability, truth commission, some of these radical changes that are being proposed, are they really timely? What are really the priorities for Dr. Abiy really to make this vision pronouncement into a reality what are really the priorities? What ought to be the priorities to bring a sustainable change?
Okay. All right. Why don't we start that side this time? You want to start?
Okay.
We'll switch it.
I think Abby's, you say Abinya? Huh? Yeah. I think many of us believe Abiy's reform idea didn't come solely from his person. It came through the sacrifice of hundreds and thousands. So it seems there is at the point of no return stage. He has the full support of the public. Yes, still he needs support within the party, but what is most important is the support from the public. He has a huge support. Not only support, as I said, he has no chance to go back. The only option he and his colleagues has to move forward on the reforms initiated. Otherwise, the result would be more chaos. I'm sure Dr. Abiy and his colleagues have learned this very, very much. So for me, that is one reliable source of support for the report, the support of the people. There are some reservations in some areas, but we have heard very recently, it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, there is also a new move in those areas to support the reform. So for me, the most important thing is the support in the public. Within the party, yes, there are some members who are very skeptical, but I am sure that they are minorities. Otherwise, many of the members are supporting the reform. With regard to the U.S. policy, I prefer Yoseph to touch upon it. The local election, yes. Even I personally believe, not only it's not a question of reaction. I personally believe it should be postponed. You know, we are now having a reform and some resistance to the reform. We are not in a settled environment. So within this unsettled environment, holding an election would mean I'm not sure if it brings the necessary result. Maybe some of us believe even this local election should be postponed so that we can have a well-organized and reliable election. There are matters to be done before the election is run. For instance, the election board should be reviewed. Still, the election board we have is an election board that many of the people do not trust. So the election law should be revised without having all this being done first. I don't think sticking to the schedule would serve any purpose. So I don't think there will be any negative reaction if the election being postponed. So the rest, yeah.
On Lawrence's question of Abimania, I think I tried to touch upon it in my remarks. I think obviously everyone is excited. There is a personal charm component to what Abiy has been able to do, granted, but the idea of the notion of institutionalizing it, if you will, like spreading the risk across government, across non-governmental actors, removing all the attention or trying to mitigate the attention from the person of Abiy is critical. I think it would allow other reform-minded people to come to the fore and assert their credentials and their viewpoints also. So I see a danger in that more or less cult-looking aspect of it. So I think there is a need to depersonalize the reforms from the person. And I think the effective one way of doing it is empowering people within the party, outside of the party, to come to the fore, share the limelight with the Prime Minister, and be part of the reform process. I would also like to comment on the question of, I think, postponing the elections. I understand the limitations. I understand there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of reforming the electoral system, starting from the National Electoral Board to the laws. I understand that the local elections are supposed to be filling over 3.5 million seats across the country, and there is no conceivable way of any opposition group trying to reorganize and be a meaningful competitor to fill all these seats. There is also this disarray even on the part of the ruling party. They haven't yet, I think, got their theme back in terms of to strategically think and lead a huge democratic process such as elections. There is also, I think, a significant component that need to be happening before any election takes place. The census was due last year in Ethiopia, according to the constitution. It has to happen every 10 years, and it didn't happen last year. It has been kept being pushed, sometimes by executive action, and the last time by parliament. It's been very controversial. In the past, census results have been very controversial and have led into conflicts in many parts of the country. So I think that there is also a need to address that part of the equation. But having said all this, I also see the danger in pushing elections. These local elections were supposed to be happening May this year, so they were pushed. The notion of pushing them again also, I think, invites a lot of questions. That the Addis Ababa and Redwa governments, for example, are on borrowed time. Their term have expired a few months ago, and Parliament had to come up with a law so that their mandate need to be extended. The same applies for all Warada and Kabale councils across the country. So these are all technically not mandated to govern as we speak. So I think some sort of an electoral process to give this state of affairs some kind of a legal backing is necessary. But I think there is a danger in trying to postpone any elections. It could be a personal thing, but I think it's just postponing processes is not always a good idea, particularly in countries like ours. So I'll say one thing in terms of addressing how deep the reforms are. I think Ameha was speaking about the public support. I think that's very visible. But in terms of trying to mobilize everyone towards that reform, particularly within the EPRDF, the one thing I think we should be paying attention to is this is beyond the leadership, beyond the higher leadership. There is over 7 million members of that party that have been brought into the fold through different incentives, particularly jobs and provision of public services and getting preferences to these services just by being members of that party. So the resistance is not going to be within the higher leadership of the party. There is going to be a lot of stake that is being threatened to be lost by these over 7 million members. So in terms of talking about how deep the reform could go and how expansive it should be, I think the simple depiction of that is looking at the bureaucracy, the civil service, which is not essentially different from the ruling party structure. So trying to deepen all these reforms need to be paying attention to this dynamic also, apart from how the coalition is going to be between the 4 ethnic-based parties and how the leadership are going to position themselves when it comes to grabbing the top positions. So that's one thing. And one last thing on U.S. support, I think we can all agree that the changes that we've been witnessing recently is essentially homegrown. It's driven by the young men and women in Ethiopia, inside Ethiopia, for the most part. So I think we need to be recognizing that, and we need to assign that ownership to the group that deserves to claim it. So when we think of supporting this momentum, past experience, again, like Sarah was saying, as an example, when we were debating the Charities and Societies Proclamation in 2009, the donor community was really pathetic. A lot of them were looking at where the dice is going to fall and then align themselves into that. So there is a sense of betrayal on the part of the civil society and human rights activists when it comes to the involvement of donors in supporting democratic processes. So I think any sort of involvement coming forward should take that into account and approach it really, really cautiously. Thank you.
I just want to make a couple of very quick additions. I think, Yoseph, you said it best, depersonalizing the reform is so important. Another way to think about it is diversifying, right? It's safer for Ethiopia, and frankly, if we think about the bomb attack over the weekend, it's safer for the Prime Minister if the reforms are diversified. Obviously, the hardliners and some of the, particularly some of the Tigrayan security officials are what I have my eye on, I think. But it's hard to read where that support really is unless the institution, until we begin to see concrete implementation and the institutions in Ethiopia have a role to play and are obligated to participate. And that is going to be very, very key. It's also where the question of accountability meets the question of reform, because to this question of sequencing and what is real and what is not, there should be no blanket amnesties. There should be no get out of jail free cards. Everything should be on the table with a recognition that participating in the reform is an important part of moving Ethiopia forward, but it doesn't excuse you from having to serve justice if you were one of the most egregious abusers. And I think that's a tremendously important message to send, but it's also a risky one. I think we have to be very aware, given Ethiopia's past and the divisions within the ruling party and the experiences of the ruling party and the EPRDF in particular clamping down. I am heartened by the youth. I think, the fact that the Prime Minister, I think, is 41 years old is not coincidental. I think that shows something about the power of the youth that the U.S. should support. I want to say a couple of specific things on U.S. policy, given that I tend to focus on the U.S. government pretty explicitly. The U.S. has a very important supportive role to play here, but we have to be very honest about the credibility of the United States government right now. Given what is going on with the executive branch, the absence of any commitment to basic human rights, the fact that the administration across the board globally has walked away from supporting human rights defenders, has sought to defund democracy and rule of law programs, has excoriated the domestic U.S. press, has treated them like they basically are something you might step on the sidewalk. I am concerned about the credibility of the U.S. engaging on a number of these core issues that traditionally the U.S. has supported. And so we have to put that out there and be realistic. I think optimistically it creates an opportunity for other donor governments to step in. And that would be very nice to see. There has historically been an active donor community in Addis that could play that role. I think of the Swedes. I think of some of the other governments. And so and Africa Bureau can't do their job and shouldn't do it. The U.S. Embassy has been very robust and strong, much stronger, in fact, than I've seen in many years, and that should continue. And Congress will obviously have to play a key role here, not just on the budget, but also in sending the message of where these core issues of human rights, rule of law, and democracy actually fit within the larger U.S.-Ethiopia policy. It's not just about getting U.S. businesses in and creating an investment climate that is conducive to development, because of the other pieces, from labor rights and a minimum wage to, fundamental free press, don't fit into that package. It's not going to be sustainable for the United States or for Ethiopia. I would say my biggest concern right now is that the Pentagon jumps in and increases its security assistance to Ethiopians. Human rights training is only as good as what actually happens on the battlefield or in the cities if it's the police. We can't just sit there and have desktop training of security forces who have cleared Leahy vetting, human rights vetting, and then send them out into the streets only to have them kill someone in the back of the head and face no accountability. The U.S. training becomes completely meaningless and just a box-checking exercise. If that happens, the U.S. does not have a great record on police training globally. I will put that out there to begin with, and it sends some measure of concern my way. So a key point to think about is how quickly the U.S. engages on security sector assistance and other kinds of military aid. The history of the security forces in Ethiopia, as you all know, is terrible. They have a robust problem with abuse, extrajudicial killings, and torture. So until there are some key concrete reforms on accountability, I would suggest the U.S. should hold off and watch.
I still don't have a microphone.
And mine won't turn off.
All right. I'm cognizant that we are sort of towards the end, but let's do a lightning round of questions. If you can keep it to questions, one without comments, that would be fantastic. I'm going to go to Mena because we need a woman to ask a question, and because she has good questions.
Thank you for your remarks. Spot on, Sarah, and all of you. I want to ask about the elephant in the room, ethnic federalism and the political context. So I do suffer from Abiy mania, but not because I'm blinded by sort of hope, but because hope leads to engagement. And so for the first time, we're seeing the Ethiopian diaspora, the Eritrean diaspora, we're seeing the leadership and the people in the country somewhat all be on the same page in terms of hope and sort of what that might lead to. But again, we cannot fail to think about the internal politics, even the internal party politics that got Dr. Abiy elected into the position he's in. So any reaction to ethnic federalism, what would have happened had Dr. Abiy not been put in this position, and the other pieces about economic growth, which I think we tend to not talk about, the importance of safety nets and human rights. It's all about, oh, look at Ethiopia as this modern country with this incredible GDP, and we're not measuring it by unemployment and poverty, but by sort of infrastructure and growth. So just questions about your reaction to that.
And this gentleman in the yellow shirt had his question up before.
Thank you. My name is Sami. I'm from Harare Heritage Association, which is a local non-profit organization. I came from the small region called Harare region. My concern is always when this kind of reform happens, the minority is the one who suffer around the globe. If you look at Cambodia, she got Nobel Prize, but Rohingya people got killed left and right. Bosnia, I was there. I was in service. I see how the minorities got suffered. I haven't heard anything about the reform is happening, but the policy on the minorities, how the Ethiopian government will protect all those minorities. Thank you.
This gentleman in the glasses.
Thank you to all the panelists. My name is Naaman from Patriotic Gimbo 7. As some of you may know, we have been branded as a terrorist thanks to the series of reforms, measures taken by the Prime Minister that has been lifted now. Now, we have embraced this change and we support the various measures taken by the Prime Minister. I would like to hear from you, what are the priorities? What should be the priorities and focus and the role of political organizations like us, as well as civil society, to deepen and strengthen this change and reform? Thank you.
We're going to do one more question. Oh, goodness. All right. You in the blue tie.
Thank you very much. I'm called Katende. I'm the ambassador of Uganda. I would like to thank all the presenters and the panelists. Two small questions. When Mr. Scott was enumerating a number of things Ethiopia must do, one of the things he said is that there is a significant number of Chinese in Ethiopia, but he didn't tell us what the problem is with that. Secondly, I happen to have worked in Ethiopia for over 10 years. And I get a sense that the development that has happened in that country is not receiving the attention it deserves here. I think it has been a significant development. And I thought that all of us here, plus the US government, should see how to help the new Prime Minister to move on. Of course, he's aware there is a lot of institutional reforms required and so on. But the message that should go out should be a reassuring message. It should not be a message of mixed feelings. Ethiopia is a very complicated country. and someone hinted on it here somewhere. They are Ethiopians here. I'm not Ethiopian, but you'll agree with me, your country is a very complicated country. And anybody who wants to help Ethiopia must take that into account and decide on the speed at which to move. Thank you.
All right. I apologize to everyone else, and hopefully our panelists will make themselves available afterwards if they're not running off, and you can ask your questions. But let's see how quickly you guys can address those questions. Go ahead.
2 minutes, lightning round.
I think on the question of ethnic federalism, I think that the point I would like to raise, there is very few complicated and sensitive issues in Ethiopian politics than this question of ethnicity, evidently. So how the ethnic federalism that this current constitution institutionalized is going to be addressed is I believe that when the people have the chance to have a more established dispensation to have all the views around it and beyond can be discussed openly and even be put to a referendum in terms of different varieties of constitutional formulations for the country. But the one thing I think a lot of people agree, including myself, is that the ethnic question has become front and center, and I think it's going to stay there. It needs to be addressed in a variety of ways, but it's there. It's the front and center of Ethiopian politics, and I don't think it will go away anytime soon. So the important thing for me is to go beyond that and trying to formulate ways of addressing it. I think that in Naaman's question in terms of priorities for political parties is, I think the space is open in theory now. So I think the first task is going to be trying to test that limit by organizing public forums, by doing series of town halls, by regrouping their supporters, reorganizing them, and then show them that there are alternatives to EPRDF's developmental democracy. So I think for them the priority needs to be regrouping and testing the limits of this new dispensation. The same applies for civil society organizations in different ways. There is a lot of issues to be focusing on, including accountability, like I said, conflict management and conflict mitigation, atrocity prevention, research, and frankly, trying to document what has been happening over the past 27 years in terms of egregious human rights violations. And when the day comes for accountability, I think that would provide a valuable input. But the one last thing in terms of accountability is, I think, and relating that to the priorities that Abiy's government should be placing, is that I think accountability does not necessarily mean that prosecution for everyone, criminal prosecution for everyone. I think it could also include a variety of coming to the truth as a society, as a community, and getting some sort of closure and move forward in terms of truth commissions, in terms of giving the people the opportunity to air their grievances and move on. So the question of accountability should not be scary for everyone, even if it is raised at this very nascent stage of Abiy's reforms. Thanks.
I would agree entirely with everything that Yoseph said, but I think the other question on priorities is that there's a balance to be struck here. There's a balance in terms of the rhetoric, and there's some benefit to Abiy mania. It's good that you're aware of your mania. It's the first step to recovery, right? But I think there's that it motivates and creates a momentum and expectations that have to be met. But there has to be. I mean, I think some of the labor movements that the labor laws that Scott was talking about are really important to starting to build confidence for business that might come in, and thinking about how do we diversify or privatize some of the businesses. This question of the Chinese, right? It's not about the U.S. versus the Chinese in Ethiopia. It's not those two countries' playground, but it's a question of how do you get Ethiopian businessmen and other businessmen and women from all over the world to engage in Ethiopia in a way that has not only a safety net, but a regulatory regime that actually is conducive to basic rights and understands and meets with this rule of law system to which the government is accountable. But at the same time, making hard, quick, smart movements on these laws that have restricted so much of civil society, has branded so many individuals terrorists, and is a critical part of rebirthing society in a sense, and recreating a fabric that has been divided and has, I think, sent many of the ethnic communities, the minorities, back into themselves because there has been nothing for them at the federal level. And so this question of minorities is hugely important, which is why I started with our Jail Ogaden report, one of the regions in the country that has been dismissed and treated so horrifically, and starting to engage the Ogaden and look at what has happened there at the federal level could send a message very clearly about a commitment to engaging minorities at a real and meaningful level.
Just a couple of points in relation to the ethnic federalism issue. It's already censored by Dr. Abiy himself and the larger public that it was at least mishandled. Ethnic identity was highly promoted over national identity, and it is taken already by the larger public as one cause for all the turmoils happened in the previous year. So it is understood there should be some sort of arrangement. So where do we go? As Yoseph said, it needs open discussion, but it is already, as I said, understood by the people leading the reform and the larger public as well. It has been promoted highly over national identity and contributed for the whole unrest we had in the country. In relation to the role of political parties, as you know, the government has done everything possible to make sure that the political opposition, especially opposition parties in the country, to remain very, very weak. And I think it succeeded. So when you talk about the role of political parties, whom we are referring, so my suggestion is, yes, you come home soon. Thank you.
All right. And finally, the ambassador, your comments are absolutely worthwhile, and I think Ethiopia's economic growth is to be applauded. It is the fastest growing economy on the continent, and there's a lot to be said there. There's a whole second panel to be had on economic opportunities and economic reforms, and that is part of the new Prime Minister's agenda. I would note this is a country of 100 million people, And like your own country, it's a very young population, median age under the age of 18. And that creates a lot of demand and expectation. And I think that that is what this government has to struggle with. The protests and the youth movement suggest that many people in the country didn't feel represented and didn't feel like they had a stake in that growth and that government. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the Prime Minister tackles that and engages and tries to make various members, minorities and majorities, and young people and old feel like they're a part of that system. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for moderating and running 15 minutes over. And thank you to the National Endowment for Democracy for hosting.